So I did have a talk, but I never worry too much about giving this talk because I feel like it's an ongoing conversation. I'll just quickly show you a couple of things, partly to just introduce a bit of vocabulary that you'll be hearing as we go along. Different people will do their own introduction of it and frame it the way that they're using these concepts, but I'll just briefly mention the way that we've been using some of these ideas and why we think this is a particularly useful thing for psychiatry to be thinking about right now. As a way to bring together things that have typically been kept apart. And again, part of this is a complement or even an antidote to the regnant position in psychiatry right now, which is that most of what we need to know ultimately is going to be about the brain, that psychiatric disorders are fundamentally brain disorders, and by understanding the particularities of different people's brains, we can come up with a very targeted, tailored kind of intervention, and that's the aspiration of this precision psychiatry kind of approach that's come out of the US NIMH and other institutions, which acknowledges that environment is important, but puts much more effort into trying to typify the brain and biological processes in great detail. So we're very interested in how to better balance that notion, not only with adding in the environment because after all, that's politically important and demographically important and so on, but because, as you'll hear today, understanding what it is the brain is doing and how the brain functions in the service of a person, in the service of a community, requires that we put those processes at the center. And there's no way to make sense, really, of brain function without considering our evolutionary history, our co-evolutionary history of adapting to niches that we ourselves have constructed. And all of that leads us inexorably toward a serious engagement with the social world. This precision psychiatry approach looks, when people try to map all the things they want to put together, it kind of looks like this. You have circles for everything. But if you look at this, what you'll see is there's a huge amount of attention to different levels of biological organization and really very modest attention to the larger world. So that's the gap that we're talking about. And again, the point is not just, let's add everything in, but that developmentally, functionally, therapeutically, if we don't take that contextualization seriously, we're not getting a grip on what's going on. And as you'll hear, the fundamental paradigm, the 4E cognitive science paradigm and activism that we're borrowing from insists that what brains are for is to mediate this process of engagement with the environment and with other people. That's where it begins, not where it ends. And that gives us a very different story developmentally and functionally of what's going on for people. So the hope is that in doing this and paying attention to life worlds and paying attention to experience, that we're really pushing back against this irony that what's called precision psychiatry, precision medicine is also called personalized medicine, because the idea is I'm going to measure your genome and I'll give you a personalized treatment, which, just like getting a personalized car, it probably means getting one of 5 varieties or something, but anyway, it's at least a little bit tailored for you. But the irony is that in that whole discussion, there's very little of what we would associate with being a person in everyday language or even in more technical views of that, because the person is more or less reduced to a whole series of these omics levels of measuring different levels of biological parameters. So many of us have been involved in sort of critiquing this, again, not in critiquing in a destructive way, not disputing that the neuroscience research is interesting and sometimes profound and has lots to teach us about ourselves, but that they're missing ingredients, and that means that we will always be limited in the story we can tell if we're only looking at the brain out of context, as it were. This is the kind of framework that the RDoC, the Research Domain Criteria, and NIMH promoted, still is being used and being elaborated in different ways. Most recently, last week we had Sinan Goloxos with us, who's been developing the idea of the exposome, so a way of saying let's not just look at all these different omic levels that are parts of the biological hierarchy of construction of an organism, but let's also look at the way the environment is constructed, and let's develop a vocabulary for that and do that in epidemiology. So we've been arguing that that view, not only do we need to be supplementing those sort of biological levels with thinking about the larger context that people are embedded in, but we need to understand mind, brain, and self as constituted precisely by those kinds of loops through the environment. And in doing that, we could begin to restore the missing person to precision psychiatry, because we would have an account of the life world that someone's living in that also constitutes them. We would have an account of their own narrative self-understanding and the versions of the self that they can deploy in relationships and so on. The kinds of things that psychiatry is traditionally used, coming out of psychodynamic theory or cognitive behavioral theory, other kinds of traditions that have paid attention to the things people say and how those structure experience, but to do it in a way that gives it equal elaboration, if you will, to the ways we're elaborating the neuroscience. So this is a recent commentary in Lancet Psychiatry with people from the group for the Advancement of Psychiatry, arguing that the kind of approach we were all taught in medical school, the biopsychosocial approach on the left, and the RDoC approach, which has some parallels to it, and then the omics approach, which is currently the sort of dominant model in biological research, all are useful in terms of characterizing different levels or layers or scales of integration organization in the biological organism. But they, first of all, they leave out those higher levels, so we talk about how we need to elaborate that social environmental level in much more detail. And they don't really answer very well the cross-cutting question, how do these things interact with each other, which is what we're always trying to figure out when we look at a clinical case or context. So we're suggesting, you see on the right-hand side, that the resources of 4E cognitive science, which talks about how human functioning and experience is deeply embodied, it depends on our bodies, and it's embedded in a social world, and it is experienced through enactment, through action, through cycles of action and perception that engage us with the world, and notably with other people in the world, that's perhaps the most fundamental part of our environmental niches. So that vocabulary, we think, it's a very rich area right now, as you'll hear, in contemporary philosophy and cognitive science and other fields. AI, robotics, all kinds of things are borrowing from some ideas there, broadly speaking, and seeing how they can be extended in ways that give us a more realistic picture of human experience. So I'm not going to belabor this because you will be hearing more, but these are some of the sort of sources and important moments in people who've tried to argue for the value of this kind of embodied and enactivist view of cognition. I should say in this context, cognition, experience are treated as all-inclusive. It's all the things that organisms do to make sense of the world and to survive in the world. So we give the broadest possible meaning to that. It's not meant to be the sort of narrow view of thinking in some kind of very abstract way. We've been interested in how that can lead us to understand human functioning in relation to the environment by paying attention to the way in which the environment is structured culturally and socially. The environments we adapt to, like sitting in this auditorium, come to us highly structured and preformed with certain affordances. There are certain things that are easy for us to do, that are presented to us, that are invitations to us to function in a certain way. We can do something we're not supposed to do. You could climb on the edges of the chairs to get to your seat, let's say, but you would be notably pushing the boundaries of what's expected in that behavior in this particular place. So in that sense, that the social cultural world is already present in the structure of the world in some ways, and that we think with and through that is, I think, a very rich and important idea. You'll be hearing later from Maxwell Ramstad about where this work has gone over the years since these kind of initial engagements happened. As I mentioned, this is very interdisciplinary work. It's been some of our work has been supported by the Foundation for Psychocultural Research. This is a book that came out of conferences and workshops that they supported. The first three of us on the book are respectively a psychiatrist, an anthropologist, and a psychologist. So there already is that bit of sort of conversation across very different disciplines. We all share an interest in culture, all in the sense that, the sense in which human life worlds are shaped by history and practices in ways that make them substantially different, and that we have to take that on board. And an interest then in approaching that not as something that's to one side of the biology. As Margaret Locke suggested years ago, our biologies are local in some degree. Even though we all have similar bodies, they are shaped in ways based on our environment, our diet, our developmental histories that are different. And here's just a reminder that if you think about how our brains have been shaped on different time scales, culture is involved on every time scale, from the phylogenetic level of how we develop brains with particular structures that allow us to live in complex social worlds and develop language and have all those kinds of skills, to the fact that for the last 50,000 plus years, we've been evolving in environments that we ourselves have constructed. So this is kind of the idea of co-evolution. To the moment-to-moment context that we find ourselves in that have been historically structured. And in the book, different contributors to the book talk about some of these different levels, the ways in which they can be studied, and the ways in which they're present within human function. All these levels, which sort of lead to different kinds of stories about development, in a sense are present and relevant to understanding moment-to-moment experience. In our discussion of these cultural affordances, we've used this Bayesian brain idea that you'll hear more about this afternoon, that tries to think about how the brain essentially tunes itself to the environment, even as it modifies the environment to meet its needs, that we're in this sort of cycle. And that in the cultural context, that happens partly by us learning how to attend. So ultimately, this is what we think is going on, something like this, or much more complicated than this. And what we do in a case formulation is we pick a few of these that we think are particularly important and where we might have some opportunity of modifying them. And we construct pictures about that. Now you'll notice in this diagram these nice little green asterisks. And what's going on there in each of those places is another complicated set of transactions that have to do with meaning-making and embodied experience. So this is just, again, a little map to remind us of some of the things that are going on in those interactions where what's at stake is, what does this mean, and how does this feel, and what kind of sense can I make of this? And the idea that that process involves both embodied experiences, things, the way things feel to us, and what comes to us from our embodied experience, and narrative processes, stories, models, structures, metaphors that are available to us and that we're being influenced by, and that we then have used to interpret in an ongoing way, moment to moment, what's going on right now. What is this about? What does this mean? How does this matter to me? So that's kind of I'm not going to say much more about it, just to say that what it leads to is a view of this sort of circular co-constitution of mind, brain, and culture, of individual experience from moment to moment, and the challenge is how to take this very broad view and begin to figure out what some of those dynamics are, and to keep our eye on what might be left out in the story. And in trying to look at these kinds of loops, which we can see clinically all the time in different areas, they're well worked out examples for things like panic attacks or anxiety disorders and so on. We're trying to keep our eye on what are the processes involved, and maybe what it means is, in addition to our use of diagnostic categories that try to pick out some kinds of ways in which certain processes hang together and create particular kinds of problems for people, that we need a kind of effort to characterize different kinds of vicious circles or virtuous circles that people are embedded in. And again, as we talk this afternoon, the kinds of modeling techniques we have available to us now let us take this general idea and begin to actually look at what would the dynamics look like, and how would the dynamics on different scales and different time scales actually interact with each other. So I'm ending here. I've gone a little bit on, but we'll adjust as we go. The implications for us in psychiatry are that an account of the mechanisms of experience and mental disorder purely in terms of brain circuitry will not be sufficient, not just because we haven't got enough information yet, but inherently because the circuits of the mind, as it were, go through the world, and that we have to somehow be characterizing those. I won't go on about it here now, but I think that things like metaphor theory that try to look at the embodied nature of language and those transactions are important resources for making sense of this. But as you'll hear today, we have a lot of other very rich resources and very acute thinking about these processes that can help us, and including help us think about the problem of agency. What is it that people can have some control over, can reassert some control over, can shape to meet their needs, and what are they not able to do? So I hope I've given a little bit of an overview that will make some of the diverse things you're going to hear today, give you one way of showing how they fit together a little bit, at least in my own mind, but I'm sure you're going to get lots of other rich and ideas as we go along. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to turn this over to our first speaker.